needed a winery in my life somehow, and went back to those same friends and that same community. And again, they just started connecting me, and I became the assistant winemaker at Darby Winery. And I worked for him for 4 years, which is where I got basically all of my education. I was not formally trained. I did not go to school for this. I just kind of worked my butt off for 4 years as an assistant winemaker. And in 2012, launched Damsel. And while I was at Darby, he was kind enough to let me start making wine off in the corner. So when I left there in 2015, I had a couple of vintages ready to go, and just kind of have been growing from there. And originally, this kind of gets to the Fates and the wine that we're going to try tonight. The Fates actually. Oh, where did we go? Is everything okay? Everybody still hear me? Yes, good. Yeah, well, I can't see myself on the picture, so I'll just keep talking. Technology is fantastic until it isn't, but we'll just keep rolling. So originally, the idea that I had with Damsel was to take some of the beautiful varietals that we grow here in Washington State and just do straight varietals as varietally correct as possible for that particular vintage. So I started out with just 100% Cabernet, 100% Syrah. And then suddenly in 2015, I was calling around. I was supposed to be getting some Grenache and some Mourvèdre to go with my Syrah from Boucher Vineyard, which is out in Yakima Valley. And we can talk a little bit more about the AVAs in Washington in just a bit. But these wonderful growers called me and told me that there was bunch rot in both the Grenache and the Mourvèdre that year. And unfortunately, when we were able to clean up what they could and send it to me, it was about 500 pounds of each varietal, which is a very small amount of wine, small amount of grapes to be making, you know, individual varietals from. So at that point, I basically made the executive decision to just co-ferment everything and chuck it all into one big fermenter as an experiment and see what happened. They do it in France all the time, right? Field blends are wonderful. Let's just try it. So I chucked all the wine together, and co-fermenting the Grenache and the Mourvèdre was actually one of the more successful experiments that I've done. So from that point forward, I knew that I was going to be doing a Rhone style blend. And once we blended the Syrah in, and the Fates was born, not by intention, but simply because it was a great experiment. So the Fates actually has continued to go ahead and be co-fermented. Every year we co-ferment the Grenache and the Mourvèdre both. We actually blend the Syrah in at about the 1 year mark, and everything then matures in barrel, in neutral barrels, puncheons, and both the 225s for about 14 to 16 months. And then we go ahead and bottle it. But the GSM blend is always one of my favorites. And that's really how the name came about too, because it was not one of these wines that I planned. The Fates being the three sisters of Greek mythology who weave together the destiny of humans seemed an appropriate name for a 3 wine or 3 varietal blend that really was just a wine of destiny. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it's continued to be one of our most popular blends, and it's typically one of my favorites every year that we've made it since. So this is the 3rd vintage, the 2017, that we'll be trying tonight. So does everybody want to try their wine? Are we equipped to talk about it and do a participating tasting? Let's see.
Mary, can I be shown the bottle again?
Yes. So this is the 2017 vintage of the Fates. It is 40% Grenache, 40% Syrah, and 20% Mourvèdre.
Poured that a while ago.
All right.
Right? And this one I think would be interesting to taste too.
So this wine always, to me, has a lot of those brambleberry characteristics where you get maybe some of the raspberry and blackberry. But the vineyard that it's coming from, Boucher Vineyard in Yakima Valley, is basically a vineyard that was planted in 1980 in the oldest AVA that we have in Washington. Yakima Valley was the first recognized AVA here in Washington. And so Dick and Luann Boucher started planting grapes there in 1980, and it has become one of the most recognizable, most reputable vineyards in the state, and I'm very, very lucky to work with them. They're incredible people, and it just has a very unique sense of place. This particular vineyard, regardless of what varietal is coming out of there, whether it's the Cab Franc, whether it's Syrah, whether it's Grenache, Mourvedre, it always has a very savory aromatic characteristic to it, maybe underlying kind of a smoked meat or a savory dried herb characteristic that I always pick up regardless of the varietal. So. Is anyone up for participating? Does anybody want to tell me what they're smelling and tasting? Is that too nerve-wracking? Well, one thing that's really great about a wine like this, and specifically wines in Washington, I think is the fact that regardless of the heat that we've had over the course of a growing season, there's a really nice acidity that's always present in a lot of the Washington wines. There are, especially, so the 4 vineyards that I work with are kind of down the center of Columbia Valley. They tend to be a little bit cooler, a little higher elevation. Specifically in Washington, 1,200 feet is considered high elevation, which, I mean, many of us have hiked higher than that, but that is supposedly the cutoff in Washington. So anything above 1,200 feet. So there's really nice diurnal temperature shifts in 2 of the vineyards that we work with, Boucher Vineyard being one of them, where Grandview and where Boucher Vineyard is located usually runs between 5 and 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding area in Columbia Valley. So those big diurnal temperature shifts allow for really nice hot days where you get plenty of ripeness for the fruit. It matures nicely. It has a good long hang time. But then there's also the fact that those cool nights preserve that acidity and some of that minerality to the wine.
Gonna pause there, and
Yeah.
if no one has any questions, you can raise your hand if you do. I have everybody else on mute, which is probably why no one jumped in to do an active participation on the tasting there.
Yeah. Oh, a smoky, jammy quality. Yeah, a lot of times, even the 100% Grenache and the 100% Syrah that I make from this particular vineyard also has that kind of smoky or smoked meat characteristic to it. It's one of kind of those things that becomes very identifiable the more wine that you drink from Boucher Vineyard specifically. And not to be kind of confused with the smoke aromas that you might get from, say, smoked taint, because there were big wildfires in Washington in 2017, which is obviously the vintage that we're talking about now, the growing year. But in our case, there were no vineyards that were affected that we source fruit from. The major areas that received some problems, and I believe to this point it's only been about 2% of the fruit that was harvested that year that was even affected, but it tended to be more along the Columbia Gorge. But we actually are not getting fruit from there. We're doing vineyards down the center of Columbia Valley. So Wahluke Slope, we have Stillwater Creek Vineyard, and then in Grandview, and Yakima Valley, we have Boucher Vineyard, and then 2 vineyards down in Horsehaven Hills, which just sit right above the Columbia River. McNary Vineyard, where we get some of our Chardonnay, and then Discovery Vineyard. Grilled meats. For pairings, or is that what you're smelling?
No, yeah, the question was, what's your favorite food to pair with this wine?
Oh, gotcha. So for pairing. Well,
Yeah.
I actually reached out to a friend of mine, to Chef Aaron Tuckleby, who basically has a restaurant. Currently, they are unfortunately closed due to our current circumstances, but he has put together a recipe that we are able to share for a roasted pork loin, an herb roasted pork loin with charred cauliflower that would pair beautifully with this wine. So grilled meats is a good suggestion.
I'll circulate that to everybody so they have that.
Cool. Any other questions? Oh, minerality, yeah. So a lot of times, you know, in Washington, preserving the grapefruit quality is one of the things that we really try to do, especially with the lighter, more delicate varietals. So with that Grenache, we really want to make sure, you know, that we're preserving a lot of that bright red fruit and a lot of that really nice acidity and almost that really delicate floral character. So we always like to try to have the Grenache be a more dominant varietal in the blend. But none of the wines that we put together, whether it's the co-fermented Grenache and Mourvedre or the Syrah, actually have any new oak on them at all. We really want this to be a wine that allows the fruit to shine through and really have that nice burst of acid at the back of your palate, just to give it a little bit of lift and to really make it a nice food pairing. In the Tri-Cities, I don't have any distribution in the Tri-Cities right now. We can ship direct to the Tri-Cities, but that is something that we are working on, and we should find a way to get wine over there immediately.
The other question here is, how long essentially do you expect this wine to age well in bottle?
You know, currently, the 2015 actually is tasting really, really well right now. Because the Grenache is so delicate and is one of the dominant varietals in this, I tend to drink my wine a little bit on the younger side. I actually like a little bit of youth. I like a little bit of fruit character. So it really kind of depends on where on the spectrum you want to have your wine tasting. So if you really want to maintain some of that youth, some of that brightness, you know, I would say 5 years is a really nice mark. Certainly you could age it longer than that, but I would expect to get more of those dried fruit characteristics. It wouldn't have that brightness, and it wouldn't have, you know, kind of those younger, more delicate characteristics from, say, the Grenache, potentially.
Then it looks like another one came through. Would you be willing to talk about some of the other wines that you produce at Damsel?
Sure. Yeah, currently we are making 2 whites. We have a companion wine to the Fates. We have a GSM Rosé, Grenache Syrah Mourvedre Rosé, that we just released. And then a lot of single varietals, actually. So we only do 2 blends. We do our red blend, which is usually a cab dominant red table wine that is very popular, really easy to drink. But we do have 100% Malbec, a Cab Franc, a Cab Sauv, 2 vineyard designate Syrahs, 100% Grenache. This year we will be releasing our first 100% Mourvedre. And we actually did a brand new wine that we just released, one of the whites that we do, which is 100% Marsanne. So I'm strictly kind of in the Rhone camp this spring with our GSM Rosé, our new Fates, and our Marsanne. So pretty excited about those. Marsanne was actually one that I had not worked with before, so that was a brand new adventure. We went down to Tablas Creek down in Paso Robles to meet with winemakers down there to ask them questions about Marsanne and what they do with their Marsanne, along with drinking some Marsanne from France and drinking some that was produced here in Washington. And one of the things that we found kind of when experimenting and trying to figure out what made most sense for our wine stylistically was the richness of the Marsanne and the aromatics. So to kind of maintain some of those aromatic white wine kind of characteristics that come from Marsanne and Viognier and Roussanne, we really wanted to do some barrel fermentation. So we actually fermented the Marsanne in barrel to give it a nice round mouthfeel. So there's almost this creamy perception of sweetness at the front of your palate. But in keeping sort of with Washington wine, that bright acidity, that nice lift on your palate, we tanked everything up and let it age in stainless steel. So it still has that richness, those really pretty aromatics, some melon, some lilies, really pretty floral characteristics, but still finishes with that really nice bright pop of acid.
There's another question that we missed back at the top. It asked, what drew you to wine? Was it something essentially younger, or was it something you found later in life?
I came to wine probably, I would say, later, in the sense that I didn't know that I really wanted it as a career until much later. I discovered how much I enjoyed wine in my 20s working in restaurants. When you get together, you know, it kind of becomes this really fun little family. You have friends that work in restaurants, you start trading bottles, you go to industry tastings, and you really become kind of geeky about it when you find something that you really enjoy. And I had a food and wine pairing. I had a really beautiful piece of lamb, and I had a really beautiful Stag Leap Petite Syrah, and my head just kind of exploded in my 20s, and it really kind of took off from there. Not a ton of people probably getting geeky about wine, starting with Petite Syrah, but that's just how it happened. But at that point, I didn't know that I wanted to make wine a career, really. I kept working in restaurants. I got a degree in landscape design and horticulture. So, like, truthfully, I have more of an education and sort of knowledge base on the vineyard side, on the plant side of things, than I ever did about enology, until I really just started working later on in, gosh, I think I started at 34, 35. So yeah, much later. My family wasn't really into wine growing up. You know, I don't have that sort of pedigree or heritage. I think it really was just, I found something later that I was really excited about, and I wanted to really get better at it and be involved in it somehow. And I really didn't know what that looked like until I was just kind of living it and working it. And now I have a winery.
Seems to kind of go that route often.
Yeah.
There's another question here that asked if I think you talked about it a little bit, but do you use new oak? I think you said specific to this blend that you did not, but what about your other wines?
So with the other wines, we do use oak. We do it very judiciously. I think, you know, new oak can be very effective, can be used very well in balancing a lot of wines, especially wines from hotter AVAs here in Washington that tend to be, you know, more concentrated, really heavy extraction, like more of those heavy stewed fruit characteristics, to balance that out with that same kind of heavy oak. But it tends to be mostly Cabernet that I use the new oak on. There's one specific clone of Syrah that we use a little bit of new oak. It's the JP Phelps clone, to get kind of geeky about it. But the Phelps clone that came out of California is very widely planted in vineyards up here in Washington, and it does very well up here. But it just has this huge kind of massive blackberry characteristic to it. It's very rich. It's very kind of, the perception of sweetness is always there. So with that specific varietal, we use a little bit of new oak for that particular clone of Syrah. But for our Cab Franc and our Malbec and some of our other Bordeaux, those Bordeaux varietals, we're using once used barrels. So we want to extract the tannin, but not necessarily those toasty, roasty, caramely, whiskey lactone kind of characteristics. We really just want the tannin to support what I feel is incredibly beautiful fruit, really. It plays definitely a supporting role.
That's a good answer.
Thank you.
Question here. I mean, we're finding that in our limited production experience so far that we are very much decreasing the use of new oak.
There's definitely a place for it. I think it's just, people I think are becoming much smarter in how they use it and just more judicious with the balance of it.
Yeah, it seemed like it became very much just a style that people gravitated to, and now it's kind of falling away from that. Another question here is, why did you go with Rhone varietals?
It just is, it's what I like to drink. It just happens to be what I think we do very well here in Washington, and it's what I tend to have the most fun making. You know, there's a lot of beautiful fruit in Washington. I mean, we grow 78 or so different varietals, so there's a lot to choose from. I think some of those grapes are grown more successfully than others. You know, a lot of times you have the right plant in the right place sort of idea, where not every you know, varietal is going to be perfectly matched. A lot of people just try and grow it just to see if they can. So I found that in trying a lot of different Washington wines, that some of the most successful wines that I thought were being made were those Rhone varietals. And for me, I think just the playfulness of the Rhone varietals is really exciting from a winemaking standpoint of view. Cabernet can be very prescriptive. You pick it at a certain point, you crush it, you destem it. You don't want it to get too hot during the fermentation. You really want to make sure you kind of baby it along. You don't really experiment and mess around with Cabernet. In my opinion, it's also the most expensive fruit that we buy. So you're taking a big chance if you kind of experiment with Cabernet. Whereas Syrah is, I think, a much more fun kind of playmate for a winemaker, where you can co-ferment it, you can crush it, destem it. We actually do stem additions back into the ferment. So we usually do about a 25% stem addition. You know, we do maybe a little bit of whole cluster fermentation. So Syrah and, you know, Grenache Mourvèdre, those type of varietals lend themselves a little bit more to, I think, experimentation and creativity, and actually sort of playing winemaker a little bit more with those decisions and some of the variables that you can sort of tweak with your wines.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that this is, I mean, from my perspective, I think Washington Rhone varietals will be something that will be gaining a lot of notoriety in the relatively near future. And I know that there's been a couple of, not that I'm necessarily a fan of wine scores, but there have been a couple of critics who have very recently commented on how exceptional the Grenache is turning out to be. Let's see. Another question: How would you recommend improving your ability to identify nuanced flavors and aromas from wine? Practice.
Ooh, I think a lot of it is essentially what we're doing here. You know, in order to flex, you know, that muscle, you have to train that muscle. So we will do blind tastings. We will do tastings from you know, specific different AVAs in Washington, vineyard specific tastings. And I think really the best way to really learn anything is really just to practice, you know, and avail yourself of all of those opportunities, whether it's trading bottles with friends, whether it's establishing a tasting group together where you all decide you're bringing Cabernet Franc from Yakima Valley of a certain vintage, and to try those wines and to really analyze those nuances and I think that's really the only way that I know of really improving those things is just trying it and drinking it.
Definitely. This one's a little more random. Have you tasted the Ampelos Rhone that we're going to be contrasting your wine with on Saturday?
I have not.
Yeah, they're a pretty small winery, so that would be a little bit on the obscure side for in there.
Well, would you care to sort of maybe do a quick?
I'm gonna leave that until people kind of taste them both on Saturday, but I will compare and contrast on Saturday a little bit for everybody.
Perfect. I will say from what I've done as far as my own personal tasting, comparing what we're doing with Rhone varietals here in Washington to potentially what's happening, you know, in the northern or southern Rhone, depending on whether you're doing like a Syrah or a Grenache dominant blend. I feel like in Washington, the fruit has a really round, rich ripeness. Whereas I think a lot of times in the Rhone wines, you typically tend to see more of those secondary flavors coming forward. It's not necessarily so fruit driven. It tends to be maybe more spice driven or more herbaceous, a little bit lighter, obviously, due to the alcohol. So here, I mean, this is potentially, I think this is like 14.9.
Then to throw
Yeah, this is like a 14.9. Like this is a pretty heavy, round, full-bodied, you know, example of a Rhone blend. Whereas typically, you know, coming from France, a Rhone style blend would typically have a lower alcohol, thus be a little bit less kind of full-bodied, more of a lighter, medium-bodied wine.
This one that we're going to be contrasting is actually out of Santa Rita Hills.
Oh, sorry.
So
Santa Rita Hills, that's going to be different too. Wow.
Right. Your assumption was very accurate that would be where we get it from, but this one's actually going to be out of.
Well, I take it all back. I have no idea then.
That was
going to be really interesting to find out.
Let me see if I think this question makes sense. How many events does your winery offer? Is there one you would really encourage an Eastern Washington gal to go check out?
Events that we attend specifically?
I'm gonna assume events that you host potentially at Damsel or.
Oh, yeah. So we actually have started doing classes. We do vertical tastings of our varietals. We did a 7-year vertical Syrah tasting back in December, and hopefully, you know, what's coming next for Damsel, we are moving right next door to our current warehouse space where we will have almost 3 times the amount of space. So we are going to have a brand new tasting room opening. We are going to be able to do a lot more events. We'll be able to do our blind tasting where we get out some of our varietals and try to trick our participants and make you guess what varietals you're tasting and really try to improve, as we were saying, some of those characteristics that we can start identifying. Yeah, we do actually quite a few of events here at the winery. But most importantly, we are really just trying to get back open so we can connect and invite people back, you know, into our space. We're really missing that connection. And so things like this are really helping kind of bridge that gap for the time being. So hopefully we'll have a lot more events posted on our page soon when we can get back open.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
So we're the guinea pigs here as somebody other than James to speak to you and ask a question.
Oh, I love it. Okay, great. Go for it.
So I did ask one in the chat of how long the actual blending process takes in total, because you mentioned that it's a full year before you even add like the rest of the grapes in for that mixing process. So how long is it in total then?
So start to finish, to make the fates, basically, during harvest, we go out and we get the Grenache and the Mourvèdre at the same time, and we co-ferment them. So we don't do any blending with those. Those end up being made together. But then over the course of that first year, we're consistently tasting barrels where we have separated out each individual varietal. So we have our co-fermented Grenache and Mourvèdre. We have our Syrah that also comes from Boucher Vineyard. And then we actually have individual Grenache and Mourvèdre, both from Boucher Vineyard. So we have a lot of things to work with. We have a lot of ingredients to kind of put into this blend. But in order to give the wine a little bit of time to mature, we basically wait for that whole first year to see how the wine is developing in the barrel before we start blending it. But we do want the wine to have some time in barrel together. So usually about that 1 year mark, we've been tasting, we kind of know what we have in each of the barrels. We start to work on the blend, you know, and we're sampling each individual wine from each individual barrel. We're getting out our little micro pipettes, we're getting out our volumetric flasks, and we're basically, you know, kind of trying to come up with that right ratio to make the most delicious blend that we can. And then we basically blend it all together in a tank, separate it back out into barrels or puncheons, and let it rest together to really try and improve the homogeneous sort of mix of the wine before it goes into bottle. So it's usually from start to finish, probably a 14 or a 16-month process, but the actual blending usually gets done in about 2 days for the final blend once we've sampled all the barrels together and kind of do our little mixing and matching.
And there was another question back there that asked about what you are looking to get out of when you add stems back in.
Oh, good question. So stem additions really are to add a softer, brighter tannin as opposed to trying to use a new oak barrel. The tannin is very different, and for something as delicate as, say, the Grenache or the Mourvèdre, to really add tannin and some structure for the fruit, we do about 25% of the stems. So we add those stems back into the fermentation. So you're extracting kind of that bitter green tannin that you get if you've ever bitten into the stem or like chewed on a tree branch. I don't know why you would, but you know, if you're like kind of chewing and that, anybody who's ever watched Psalm, you know you've chewed on a tree branch. You know you have sucked on rocks, chewed on tree branches, cut that garden hose to smell it. Like, I know you have, if you're serious
I don't know
about
about
it.
sucking on a rock, licking the rock. Yeah.
Licking
might be
river
taking
rocks, like
another one.
minerality. Now I know what a wet stone tastes like. You know, you're really checking out those tasting notes. But it adds that nice bitter green, bright tannin as opposed to overpowering the fruit in a heavy oak barrel. So we're just looking for a lighter, brighter tannin that still gives support to the fruit without overpowering those really delicate, pretty characteristics that we want to preserve.
Maybe also, I know this is a tool that we've used with some of our runs, but maybe if you could talk about the whole cluster that you mentioned with the GSMs as well, that'd be great.
So whole cluster fermentation is a process by which you're really not introducing any yeast. You don't crush the fruit at all. You don't destem it. You're really just basically using the weight of the fruit itself in a fermentation vessel, whatever you're fermenting in. And the weight of the fruit simply like starts to split the grapes as they're still hanging on that whole cluster. And so what happens is naturally occurring yeast that is sitting on the outside of the skins or on the stems is then basically starting fermentation inside each individual grape. It's carbonic maceration. So you basically start this little fermentation inside each of the berries. And then as the weight of the fruit continues to press down on top of the clusters, the fruit, eventually the skins will get thinner, they'll start to macerate, kind of break down, and then you get an entirely different kind of fermentation. So the carbonic maceration starts, you tend to get some very interesting kind of earthier secondary and tertiary flavors that kind of come out of that different fermentation. And then you also get obviously the same tannin you would from, you know, me doing stem additions. The stems are already in there for the whole cluster. So you're really just using a different characteristic to kind of coax some of those different flavors out of the fruit.
Okay. So another question here was, so when you have to top the barrel for the co-ferment, what do you use for that?
I top everything with Syrah. Syrah is my favorite varietal. If I was stuck on a desert island, I would want Syrah with me, probably 9 times out of 10. So I think everything is improved with Syrah. So everything gets topped with Syrah, always.
Not a bad choice. Which part of Boucher did your Syrah come out of, or do you take it out of a number of different blocks there?
So everything actually, all my fruit except for the Marsanne is coming from the top of the hill near their home and their barn. So the Mourvèdre is coming from way up at the very top of the mountain. Down by their house, there's some Clone 174 Syrah that's down by the house. There's Grenache straight across from the barn. So everything's coming from that top higher elevation up near the house and the barn. I get Cab Franc up there too. It's the one row that runs right along the road. So you can go wave to the vines.
I don't think I ever had.
If you're ever out there.
We do end up out there. We also have Syrah there. It's excellent. So.
Top block, or are you from Lower Vineyard? Upper Vineyard.
We could be right next door to each other.
Oh, nice.
Let's see. So, question is if they want to order your Cab or Malbec Syrah, how would they go about doing that? Can they order it online and have it mailed, or probably?
Yeah, actually, right now, online there are shops obviously that have some of my wines. The most comprehensive, obviously, is to go straight to the website. And currently, because of our situation, we have 3 ways to get wine to people. We are doing direct shipping. We're doing free shipping for a case or more. Anything up to 11 bottles is a $10 flat rate shipping. We also have winery pickup. We are doing a drive-through delivery out of the back of the winery. Like, we just go out here, we open a garage door, we set up a tent, we have like a little railing, you just drive on through and can pick up your wine on Saturdays and Sundays 1 to 5. Or we also have white glove delivery service in and around the Puget Sound area. So I will show up and bring your wine to you right now. That is the new reality that we are living in. So yeah, we have plenty of ways to get your wine to you safely.
I think this one was Leavenworth, but if you need it, we'll find a way to get it up there. Let's see. This one was, I have a home brew kit and plan to make a batch of wine this fall. What variety would recommend for a first timer?
But what? I'm sorry?
The person here has a homebrew kit and plans to make a batch of wine this fall. What varietal would you recommend for a first timer?
Oh, well, kind of keep playing on the same theme of Syrah, but if you can find yourself some good Syrah grapes, I don't know if your home kit comes with actual grapes or if you were planning on getting them from another source, stealing them from your winemaking friends, peeling off 100 pounds here or there. But I would try and get some Syrah. Syrah tends to be very forgiving. When you're first starting out, that's why I actually chose Syrah and Cab Sauv to start. When I started in 2012, I thought those were going to be the wines that I could execute, that I would be most successful executing, simply because I think, Syrah tends to be more forgiving than a lot of different varietals.
To the person who asked that question, get in touch with me. I'll help you.
There you go. Get the good fruit. I worry about it's the fruit quality with the home kits that I think tends to discourage a lot of people, that it doesn't turn out necessarily like the wine that you are drinking, that you're getting from your local wine shop. It's definitely quality of fruit you can't scrimp on. You could be the most talented winemaker on the planet, but without good fruit, you're going to be lost.
Yeah, absolutely true. How do you choose growers? How have you chosen your growers?
So I actually was lucky enough to be introduced to some really wonderful growers just based on my experience working for other winemakers and getting those introductions. I think a lot of it, again, was tasting the wine. So finding other people that I respected, tasting their wine, asking them questions about the vineyard, about vineyard management, doing some research on my own. And then really a lot of it was, can I get into those vineyards? And do they have fruit available to me? And so being able to build relationships too with those vineyard managers was really important. So a lot of it was going out, using those introductions that I got, but really trying to find people who had a similar philosophy, who could teach me and help me kind of understand what their philosophy was about growing the grapes. Since I'm not privileged enough yet to have a state fruit, I would love to have my own fruit one day and control the whole process from start to finish. But vineyard management requires a whole nother skill set. So that's a whole nother animal that we'll have to tackle on another day. But finding good growers and vineyard managers is incredibly important. There's a lot of times where there's basically kind of three things that go into the winemaking. You have your site and what the site gives you, and how the fruit reacts to that site where it's planted, sun exposure, elevation, the right varietal planted in the right place, soil drainage, soil structure, all that good stuff. So there's what the site's giving you. Then there's how that site is being managed and the choices that that grower, farmer, vineyard manager is making about that fruit, and whether or not that fits the style of wine you're trying to make, or the philosophy that you're trying to promote. And then once the fruit gets to you as the winemaker, you know, that's the other third that goes into it, is the choices that the winemaker is making. Yeast, crushing, destemming, aging, barrels, you know, all of those variables too. So there's really like three great components that go into that. And really finding those relationships with the vineyard manager is incredibly important. That's, you know, a whole third of the winemaking process. Super important.
Do you have a wine club?
I do have a wine club. We actually have 3 different levels of wine club. You can find that on our website, and there are different participation levels for everyone. We want everyone to feel included and welcome. We have 3 shipments each year, and we actually try and we have 2 parties usually for pickups here at the winery, and then one we have out at Lake Sammamish. One of our partners has a beautiful house out there, and so we go party at the lake for our summer release, and I'm hoping that everything's back to normal by July so we can go party at the lake. A mix of white and red. Oh, our wine club? The wine club question about whites and reds. Did I just see that correctly? So we actually do primarily reds. We started including whites with a particular level of wine club that we do. So there is a mix, but typically it's like 95% of the time we're releasing red wine. But we're happy to switch things out. We're very accommodating. I still know most of my wine club on a first name basis. We have maybe 200 members, and they're all very active. I see them quite a bit, and they've been incredibly supportive. I'm very lucky to have the people involved in the winery that I do.
Hopefully it's 200 and a few more after this.
Hopefully a few more. We'd love to have more.
What's the website?
What's the what?
Your website.
Oh, the website? It's just damselcellars.com.
Perfect.
Yeah.
This is a fun question. Have you ever tried to produce a Pinot Noir?
I have not tried to produce a Pinot Noir. Part of that, really, I feel like Oregon just such has the corner on that it's not a great varietal that I am like currently seeking to add to my portfolio. I feel like what's being grown in Washington is okay, but what's being grown in Oregon, it just, again, with the right plant in the right place, seems to be, if I did make Pinot, I feel like I would need to go down to Oregon to get the fruit, and I don't quite have those connections yet to know where I would like to get fruit from. I've been down there a lot. I've had a lot of Oregon Pinot. There are some sites that I would be very interested in, but I have yet to find a grower down there to work with.
Do you have a favorite Pinot that you've had?
So when I was down there last, there's a small winery that's just now starting up in the last few years called Purple Hands. They are in Dundee, and they're doing a fantastic job. They're really small, really scrappy, have some really great vineyard connections, but they're doing some really, really pretty Pinot. And 2016 was the last vintage of theirs that I had. I'm sure they've released more since then, but 2016, it was really an interesting year for the Pinot that they were making. It wasn't quite so delicate. It had more body to it, much like a Northern California Pinot. So it was a really interesting mix of that really kind of earthy sort of Oregon Pinot flavor and aromatics, but with like a bolder, more full-bodied style. It was really interesting. So I would check out Purple Hands if you want to see like smaller, more interesting Pinot. Of course, there's some really beautiful things, you know, all of the Demand Druin and Demand Serene and like all those guys, Soder, Patricia Green. There's a lot of beautiful Pinot down there, but Purple Hands, I was really impressed on my last trip down there with their wines.
Absolutely. There's a lot of great wine coming out of there as well. I think we've hit all the questions at this point in time.
Excellent.
Pierce, anything you want to throw in here?
I think I've said everything. Is Pierce? Did you guys want to talk about anything?
I just got unmuted. I don't think I have anything to add at the moment, but fabulous job. Thank you so much for answering everybody's questions and being so engaging and knowledgeable.
Yeah, thanks for coming out, you guys. I really appreciate it. I hope you have enjoyed the wine. Again, this is one of my favorites. I look forward to this one coming out every year, and I hope it stands up against your Santa Rita wine. I really like to see how it compares. I'll look for some notes. I'll follow up with Pierce and with James to see how it stands up, what the comparison is.
I dropped you a message too. I would be happy to get you a bottle of the Ampelos as well to make sure you have.
I'll call in on Saturday and sit in the corner and just
yeah exactly. Yeah, I'll bring it to the drive-thru. It'll be perfect.
Awesome. That'd be very cool. Well, thank you so much for setting this up, James. Thank you, Pierce. And thanks everybody for your support. These are really extraordinary times, very weird. If you had asked me at the beginning of 2020 if I would be doing video chats with people, I probably would have said no. This is my first one doing this. So thanks again. And everybody stay healthy out there. Cheers.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. We'll see you Saturday. Go ahead.
No.
You can't do it. No.
Hi, Maggie and Sammy.
She's muted though.
I know. Excellent job, James. Great facilitator.
Thanks. Do you know what
She said you're quiet.
you know what a great
A little quiet. I don't know if it's the speaker on Emily's computer or what.
That's mine.
Not my computer.
You know what a great tool this is? You can mute your sibling.
Yeah, Pierce was muted like the whole time.
I didn't even mean
Yeah, he was like, oh, thanks for unmuting me.
Person.
So
No, not
go
yet.
to this arrow
Mm-hmm.
and then hit audio settings
Mm-hmm.
and then
See, it is. That's the
video.
weird.
No, go to
Oh.
video.
Where?
Well,
there,
right
got it.
there. Oh, weird.
See,
Okay,
I had it.
get out of there.
Okay.
People are probably messaging you. You muted Maggie.
I didn't do her on purpose.
Sorry, Maggie.
Unmute.
We're trying to unmute you.
Okay.
Here you go. Isn't there a way to? Oh,
I'm unmuted.